Hey everybody, it's Brittany. Today I'm going to be giving our presentation on Histories of Scale, the theme for this week. But what I'm going to be focusing on is microhistory, and the microhistory specifically outlined by Dr. Peter Jones. Dr. Peter Jones has a doctorate of philosophy. He works at Glasgow School of Geography and Earth Sciences. He's a senior research associate of geography, and he used to work at the University of Leicester, if I'm pronouncing that right. He focuses on English history during the 19th century, and that is what the work we're going to be reading this week specifically focuses on as well. And he has one book published called Pauper Voices, Public Opinion and Workhouse Reform in Mid Victorian England. So we'll get into what a pauper means throughout this presentation, but that was one of those words this week that I had to personally look up because I'd never heard that term. So macro history is kind of our standard history that we all research and know about today. It's studying World War II as a whole. It's studying American history. It's studying British history, colonialism, African history. It's more bigger picture history. And then we have micro history, which is the opposite of it. And it focuses on the more individual histories of people, understanding how they lived their everyday lives, their thinking process, and how it led to the trajectory of their entire life. So, within macro history, sometimes we can downplay or even ignore the importance of individual agency in history and group people together based on similar characteristics. So, all poor people are usually the same. All middle class people are the same. All rich people are the same. All politicians, all religious people, etc. But microhistory is arguably not so much a historiographical approach as it is an intention or a commitment to reducing the scale of historical inquiry. Now, this was a quote directly from Dr. Jones, and I liked this quote a lot and thought it made a lot of sense because you're still getting to understand the bigger picture of history when you look at individual history, but you're focusing on the everyday people. So, me and you, how did people live their lives? And it can be viewed as a more respectful way of showing people's lives. So, like, we're going to get into the pauper history. Their history is something that's usually just looked over. I had personally never heard of these institutions or these kind of people within England. I don't know very much about British history. So, throughout his work, Dr. Jones talks about pauperism, workhouses in London. So, before we get into anything, I thought I would explain what these mean. So, pauperism is a condition of being poor. Just any type of poor people throughout Britain would have been called this. And workhouses were these institutions where poor people, older people, orphan children would have been sent to these institutions as a place to live. So instead of having a welfare system where we send people to Section 8 housing or maybe even foster care, they'd be sent to these workhouses and they got to live there, quote, for free, but had to work while they were there. A lot of times, these places might be considered a prison. They had to ask for permission to leave. As we'll see later on in the story, our main character had a lot of hard time trying to leave the institution to find work, and they were subjected to hard manual labor. There's a lot of child labor, and they focused more on profit. So, having people work in factories and other ways of making the actual place money over their safety or even rehabilitation of getting back to living a normal life, being able to support yourself and your family. One example of this is given by Dr. Jones, and this is the story of the very ordinary man, Frank Burge, who was described as being in and out of employment, but was a legal clerk who started working at the Poplar in the East End of London in 1883 with his family. So rather than being somebody who was more institutionalized, where he grew up in these workhouses and his parents were poor, he's poor, this kind of generational or habitual state of being poor, he was actually a solicitor and did have good enough money to support him and his family, but then fell on hard times. And what we see is these types of people might have been treated a little bit better or given more assistance than those who were consistently in the system. Now, we'll see later on, he actually did spend a little bit of time in his adolescence in these institutions, but in the grand scheme of things, he did not necessarily grow up in these types of places. Now, the thing about Frank Burge is he wrote several letters complaining about the conditions and treatment at these workhouses over the span of 2 years. So basically, what happened with Frank is he had requested to leave the workhouse for 3 weeks, but was denied as the guardians of the workhouse. So the guardians would have been people who were in charge, might think of them as a corrections officer if you're thinking of a modern day prison. They were the people who ran the institutions. And they denied his request of leave for 3 weeks because they claimed it would disturb the discipline of the workhouse. So, as I mentioned earlier, in order for these workhouses to be considered free to people, they had to work. They had a lot of chores. As you can see in the picture on the screen, there was a ton of people within these workhouses, and they all had to work to keep it running, and then they often used their labor to make money. So, being denied work sent Frank on a sequence of seeking justice and, as Dr. Jones put it, quote, making a drama out of a crisis. So he made several complaints stating that when he moved to the workhouse, he was denied access to his savings that he had deposited with the workhouse authorities, that he was denied the liberty to mend his own furniture that he was storing on the workhouse campus. And then another instance is he had left for, I believe, 2 weeks on a short term employment gig, but I guess he did not get the proper paperwork in order to be able to do so. So he spent 14 days in jail and was accused of deserting the workhouses. So just leaving these workhouses could be a serious offense. And he claimed that the workhouse did not want him to grow out of pauperism and that there was a fine line between the prison and the workhouse. And he also described it as being like an insane asylum. Just the people were treated so badly. And the Board of Guardians responded to his complaints by stating that his permission to leave the workhouses was only allowed from time to time and for shorter stints, such as once a week or up to 2 weeks, as permission to leave the workhouse for extended periods of time had been found to be abused. But despite his complaints, he was allowed to leave before and after filing these complaints and was able to earn money from these short term employment opportunities he was given while his family was still being supported by the workhouse. Still, he decided to pursue legal action against the guardians, and he wanted to be heard so badly that he even went as far as to turn his complaints and his situation into a dramatic play called Love and Money, or The Breach of Promise. He also tried to have an article published by the Daily News, but that never happened. And then he even wrote the manuscript of a book and gave it to a reporter who was supposed to try her best to have it published, but then ended up suing her 18 years later because he claimed she didn't try hard enough to have it published. So he took his complaints and what was happening to him very seriously. So, uprisings against the workhouses. So, we see several cases of people complaining about the conditions of workhouses throughout Britain. I'm sure you can look up and find several cases and letters and other complaints similar to these. But what the author, Dr. Jones, decided to do in this article was to try to focus on people who came from similar financial situations as Frank. We have Henry Jones. He was a former seaman who wrote 6 letters complaining about the treatment at the workhouse to the Poor Law Board between May and July of 1868. We have Mungo Palmer, who was a formerly wealthy merchant who had lost everything and had launched his own campaign against the Bethnal Green workhouse from 1866 to 1872. Thomas Gold, John Rutherford. And something that the author pointed out was that the majority of people who submitted complaints against the guardians or the conditions of the workhouses were usually found to be men. And he's not making the claim that women weren't allowed to make complaints, but that they just didn't do so as much. And he also says that women who launched complaints against the workhouses usually did so in a very different manner than men. They usually didn't mention their status, so they didn't say, I used to be a wealthy merchant, but rather would focus on describing themselves as oppressed. So we see this with Frances Land, and she had submitted, that we know of, 8 letters complaining about the conditions of the workhouses, complaining about tyranny, the quality of food. But what was particularly different in her experience was that she actually was begging for protection for complaining against the guardians and local powers. So she didn't want to be punished for submitting complaints. And this is something that a lot of people who would complain would experience. So, as Frank had said, after he had submitted complaints, he was sent to the rock yard, basically where he had to crush rocks all day and even accused the guardians of turning his family against him. But women who had submitted complaints were much more respectful and kind in their letters and used words like, "Will you please confer a favor?" So, quite a bit of a juxtaposition from how the men did. So, one thing that Jones points out is at the time, people like Frank would have been accused of being paranoid. So, something that we have at this time is querulous paranoia. So, this was coined by German physicist Kraft Ebing, and he described people who were persistent about claiming injustice, petitioning against the authorities, as being somebody who just had paranoia. They were just always anxious and felt like people were out to get them. And what's sad is that a lot of people at this time who were experiencing genuine complainable offenses were just thought of as, oh, they're crazy, ignore them. But by the mid to late 20th century, this diagnosis of paranoia was becoming less popular. And by the 1970s, psychologists became more aware of how this type of paranoia was just being used to ignore the complaints, especially of those from lower classes. Historian Ollie Stalstrom argued that many prisons use this tactic as a way to silence inmates or those questioning authority. With that, Frank probably was somebody who would have been accused of something like this at the time. And the question has to be asked, was he right in his complaints about the condition of the workhouse, about how they were trying to keep him from being able to support his family? So we have to ask ourselves, was Frank just being defiant and causing the guards consistent trouble? He complained in several letters, wrote plays, kind of went to what some might describe as a more extreme side of a complaint. Or was he right in his complaints and being accused of paranoia as a ploy to ignore him, as Salstrom suggested in the 1980s? We have to consider, though, he wasn't the only inmate at these British workhouses to complain about the living conditions or the treatment. And a lot of his complaints were similar to those complaining, not being able to leave, subject to very hard labor. In this term of microhistory importance, we have to look at Frank Burge as the case of somebody coming from higher status. So, as I had mentioned in one of my first slides, we kind of can think that people who might have come from higher status might have been treated a little bit better than those who were habitually poor. But Frank Burge might be the case of somebody who did come from a higher status and fell on hard times, but yet was treated the same as all the other paupers. And while he spent a few years as a child living in workhouses with his family, he was eventually able to be successful and have a job that was enough to support him and his family. Did he have a harder time accepting the rules of a workhouse compared to those who might have grown up in the system? Now, these aren't my questions that I want to ask all of you, but it's just something that I think we should keep in mind. So, another thing is the importance of microhistory as a whole. So, microhistory accounts for the normal everyday life of people in a society, of a culture, of a time period. And how I like to think of it is like the pieces of a puzzle. So that's why I put a picture of a puzzle. All these smaller pieces build up to the whole of a society. Mine and your lives might be insignificant in the grand scheme of history, but the things that we do, I believe, affect the greater whole of our world. Another important reason to study the microhistory of people is to challenge the traditional historical narratives. So the people at the time would have thought of paupers as maybe these annoying people who are given free housing. They should have nothing to complain about, or they have this paranoia and that's why they're complaining. Their complaints aren't genuine concern. Looking back in retrospect, we can see, well, they did have a point, and what they were saying wasn't untrue. They were being treated badly. And then another reason to study microhistory in this case is we can better analyze the political, social, cultural, and economic forces at play on the everyday people. So, why were there so many people in these workhouses? What was the economic state of Britain during the 1800s? And by looking at this, we can see how the effects of a hierarchy of the economy, etc., affect the everyday people. These are just some of my references. So here are my questions for all of you. 1, can microhistory be studied with the Annales school of thought? So, microhistory, we're looking at the individual people, but within the analysis school, we are looking at the longue durée of history. Is there a way for us to study both the microhistory but the longue durée, so a 300-year period of people? Number two, in education, should teachers focus on microhistory or macrohistory? Is there a perfect harmony that they can gain from working in both? Or is it too difficult for the busy life of a teacher to try to include so much? I know a lot of you are teachers, so I thought this question might be really interesting to you all. And then, what do we gain when observing the lives of everyday people? And what do we miss? So, if we only focus on the everyday people and the micro history, do we miss out on the bigger picture? And lastly, would complaints such as from Frank Burge have been taken more seriously if he had been from a more noble class or status? So, yes, he did come from a little bit of money, but he wasn't this grand solicitor who was a millionaire. And then another part of this question, if a British noble were to visit a workhouse and submit similar complaints against the conditions, would they have been taken more seriously or eventually changed? Now, here's a way for us to relate this to the time we're living in now. So, consider a person living in Section 8 housing today complaining about horrific living conditions, such as their house or apartment falling apart, not being maintained by a landlord, full of bugs, etc., or a family on food stamps complaining about the quality of food they're able to purchase with the funds and budget given. How might they be looked at those of higher financial situations? Would our society and culture take them seriously and their complaints? I really look forward to reading all of your guys' responses. Thanks for watching and good luck.